welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us to Get the Facts Straight in Conversation with the Lab, which is a partnership between CBHS and the Westmead Institute of Medical Research Foundation, also known as WIMR. As well as our huge member community that's joining us today, I'm really pleased to say that CBHS has quite a few of its own. So a number of staff are also joining and listening in today, and a big welcome to staff, members and other key stakeholders. At CBHS, we're proud to be able to put something like this on as part of our focus on the health and happiness of our member and staff communities. And there's no arguably bigger health topic at the moment than right now with the world focused on COVID-19. This is our way of keeping you informed in one of the areas where we see members can belong to more being a part of CBHS. Today we're going to be talking about vaccine, and vaccines play a key role in COVID recoveries as a nation. And there's no better place to get this conversation started by getting the facts about the current state of play than from some of Australia's leading scientific minds. Two researchers you'll meet today are Professors Tony Cunningham and Sarah Palmer. And they're co-directors of the Centre for Virus Research at WIMR. Their combined expertise make us very fortunate to hear from them today. And as you'll see, the questions that have already been posed to the panel will draw out some really key insights from this key group. I'd also like to take the opportunity to introduce you to Ivan Power, who for his executive positions, he's had an extensive experience in financial markets and investment management over 20 years at Macquarie Bank and the Macquarie Group in a variety of senior roles in Sydney and London. And he's currently leading the portfolio and performance for Macquarie Group. But today we have him in this capacity as a director and chair of the Westmead Institute of Medical Research. And so without further ado, I'd like to now hand over to Ivan Power. Thank you.
Andrew, thanks very much, and thanks for that very warm welcome and for the opportunity to be speaking to you and your members today. The Get the Vax Straight sessions that we've organised, I think this is probably well into the late teens in terms of the number of sessions that we've had, and really was an initiative of mainly the scientists at Westmead who felt a real urge to make sure that people in all of their capacities, but in particular business leaders, had the opportunity to really get some clarity on information around COVID direct from the experts instead of going through convoluted other measures which you might have. We found that every session that we've had working from the beginning has got more and more attendees and a greater level of engagement from people as they're asking more and more questions, as they feel empowered to ask questions, and really as they feel interested to be asking those. So I would encourage everyone that's watching, if they have a question, please log into the chat function. We already have 7 logged already, in addition to the ones that we will cover off during the course of general discussion, that we'll leave time to be covering off at the end of today's session. So I'd really encourage you to do that. I won't waste too much time with introductions, other than to say, as attesting to Andrew's introduction, that we have really 2 of the most qualified people in the country, if not the world, to be talking to you today on the subject of COVID and vaccination. These two people, Sarah and Tony, who you will see in a second, as Andrew said, are co-directors of the Centre for Virus Research at Westmead Institute for Medical Research, or WIMR, as I'll refer to it. And Tony and Sarah have worked extensively over many years with a long track record in HIV and dealing with an illness as complex and as difficult as HIV, have pivoted this onto COVID over the course of the past 15 months. and as we speak are actually in the process of developing a vaccine, a second generation vaccine, to be working with to particularly the elderly, which I think we'll come to in a second. So these are not only practitioners that are called upon by governments and organisations globally for advice on the pandemic. They're actually practically working through the issues involved in developing a vaccine. So I think they're reasonably well qualified. And a little bit about Westmead, in that, as most of you would know, it is one of the largest, if not the largest, multidisciplinary health precincts in Australia. It was at the forefront and remains at the forefront of how COVID is handled across the health system in New South Wales, which has been reasonably successful because of its position at the centre of the Westmead Health District in terms of handling very early patients that actually acquired the disease, the treatment of those patients, handling the pathology in relation to testing, working through the issues as to contact tracing, and as we're hearing now, working through issues about the development of vaccines and how all of those things tie together in terms of the broader public health response to COVID. So without ado, maybe Tony, if I could pass to you, and Sarah, tell us a little bit about where we're at in COVID from a global perspective, and about how Australia actually has Australia's response and where Australia is at in terms of dealing with that, particularly in light of the news we got yesterday from down south.
Sure. So Ivan, I think we are really, really fortunate to be living in Australia. Even though there is a new cluster of local infections in Victoria, and up to 15 infections right now, the infection frequency of COVID-19 in Australia has been really low compared to the rest of the world. And this is due to the fact that we are an island nation and we are able to close our borders, and also that a very strict quarantine system was put in place for those who were returning to Australia, especially during the height of the pandemic. But if we look outside of the borders of Australia, we see that that's not quite the case in other countries. For example, India, Brazil, Argentina, Thailand, and Nepal are all experiencing increases in infections. India alone is experiencing over 200,000 infections, new infections per day, and that's probably a low estimate. So it's really very important that we do roll out the vaccine. And the reason that is important is that if we look to the United States, where the infections were extremely high, now nearly 60% of the population in the United States have received at least one vaccination, and the infection frequency in the United States has dropped by 35%. In fact, the infection rate now in the United States is less than it was a year ago in June. So vaccination is important. And also what this virus has shown us is how interconnected we are globally, and that vaccinations need to be rolled out across the globe. Tony, do you have something?
No, I completely agree. One of the things I think that there's a few things that we still don't know, and that everybody expects us to know, and that's really an indication of just how quickly this whole field has moved. We don't know how long vaccines last. We don't know what's going to happen next with new strains developing, and we do know that many of those new strains have been already identified in quarantine in Australia, and the first time we've seen the strain that originated in India escape from quarantine in Melbourne, and that is a more transmissible strain. So there's a natural degree of caution, and Ivan, what I see is because we've been so successful in control of this virus, there are regional debates emerging, and also debates between people with different points of view, and that is in essence about when the borders should open, how we should actually handle the epidemic, and I think all the time we have to remember the impact that when one of these outbreaks gets out of just out of minor control with just 15 people, how it creates a fair degree of minor panic. And if you go back to how we were with Victoria, We just simply cannot have that happen again. So it is incumbent, I think, on all Australians to do the right thing and get immunised. It's really important. And it's important for the world to be immunised, because the more that this virus spreads, not only we see the misery we've seen in India, but the more variants will emerge, and that will make a harder job for people trying to create new vaccines, new boosters in the future. So we need to support those of our politicians, including perhaps the President of the USA, in trying to push the dissemination of vaccines worldwide through COVAX and other areas. New Guinea is a perfect example. Sarah left New Guinea off the list, and I think the reason you mentioned Thailand is that it's been well controlled, but all of a sudden has got out of control.
That was Taiwan.
Taiwan, and yeah.
Yeah, Thailand is having also an increase, but Taiwan.
But Thailand
had,
too, I think. Yeah.
Taiwan had a very low infection frequency and only 9 deaths, but they have had an outbreak from a quarantine.
Yeah, but I'm talking about countries that have been traditionally low, and I think Thailand was one of those. And then all of a sudden they've emerged. So you can't be complacent with this virus, and particularly with new, rapidly spreading variants. So please, everyone, get immunised.
So Tony and Sarah, if we go back to first principles then, some of the criticisms that people have, or the misinformation that some people may have, is that there's been corners cut in the way, the speed with which these vaccines have been developed and approved. So before we get into, which we will cover off, about AstraZeneca and risks versus Pfizer and various other things, have there been corners cut, and is there kind of more risk attached to the approvals that have been given to these vaccines than what we might have seen in the past?
Yeah, so it does seem like these vaccines were developed very quickly, and I do understand that. And the public perception is that they have been developed very, very quickly. But in 2003, we had SARS-CoV-1. And at that time, the US government and other governments across the globe started putting money towards vaccine development for coronaviruses, because it really was realized at that point that these viruses could lead to a pandemic. So really, the overall development of these vaccines have been going on for about 17 years. And once we knew the sequence of SARS-CoV-2, then we could very quickly pivot the work that's been done on SARS-CoV-1 to developing vaccines against SARS-CoV-2. And also the increase in knowledge in our technology over the last 10 years has allowed us to really develop messenger RNA vaccines and also other vaccines that are very, very effective. I must say that we were very happily surprised, or very happy to see how effective these vaccines are. And we're very fortunate that they are this effective. But to be honest, this technology, these vaccines have been developed over 17 years. And it's just the technology available that we have in the last 10 years that allowed us to very quickly pivot and then make vaccines very quickly within several months towards this pandemic.
So I've been a member of a group of experts that have been pulled together to have a look at potential approaches to RNA vaccines in the state. So going back into that history, when you make an RNA vaccine, you need the RNA, which is a fragile molecule, put into a fatty envelope. The development of both of those aspects goes back 10 years. And the companies that have been involved in the development of the fatty envelope, this is a highly complex business involving 12 steps and many, many components. And in fact, these vaccines have been tried out in animal models in a number of different viruses, including flu and including herpes. And so the reason Pfizer was able to move so quickly is they already had this vaccine in development for influenza, and BioNTech, which is the biotechnology company, very quickly pivoted from flu into COVID. So corners have not been cut, but what we've seen is probably what we need to see, and that is a compression of the phases of trials and approval that need to be done, and that was accomplished through in the USA through Westmead, which was headed up by a general used to military precision, and also by a colleague and friend of mine, Monsef Slawi, who'd been the global head of vaccines for GSK, knows all of the regulatory issues and had been on the board of Moderna. So they knew the traps and they knew how to push things along.
But even though it looks like they were approved quickly, they went through all of the steps that vaccines are required to go through, but just at a quicker phase. But they really did go through all those steps that are required to approve a vaccine. And the FDA and also the TGA have spent a lot of time to ensure that these vaccines are safe.
Yep. TGA is a statutory body which is at arm's length from government and advises government in Australia. And of course, that's the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and government has to take its advice.
And I think just going to those points, the transparency actually in those processes has been shown through the information and sometimes the uncertainty, in particular with regards to the AstraZeneca vaccine and some of those areas. Certainly from when I've gone down the wormhole of looking into all this and going down various internet searches and looking into various research papers, what's very clear is that the approval processes are seeking to flush out all of this information in real time, which, from my perspective, really adds to the confidence level that you have in these approval processes, because they're albeit that they're accelerated, they still are very deliberate and exhaustive in terms of the information that they actually are able to flush out.
Absolutely.
I was going to say the Therapeutic Goods Administration, a friend of mine has moved there from being the medical director for GSK. They've set up a 2-year assessment of the safety of the vaccine, and also ATAGI, the advisory body for the government, has set up a similar safety enterprise, which is run out of the Children's Institute next door. So that's again at arm's length from government. And so that's giving us a lot of information about side effects. And it's interesting how people focus in on the very rare AstraZeneca side effects. And if you look at the latest TGA figures, there are 1 in 100,000. And in fact, the death rate has dropped from 25% to 1 in 24, and will probably drop lower at 4%. So that's 1 in 2 million. Crossing the road will probably get you killed 1 in 67,000 times. So, and people often forget that almost all vaccines will have some rare side effects. So will the oral contraceptive pill. So will breast implants, as we heard the other day. Pfizer and Moderna both actually cause severe allergic reactions, but we can handle those by just simply observing people for half an hour after they have the vaccine. So the important thing here is, with more knowledge, that we learn how to handle these very, very rare side effects, and people take them into proportion.
So Tony, that's a really, really important point that you've just hit upon there. And so if people can recall when the AstraZeneca news came out about some of these clots, the first thing that came to people's minds was, yes, the clots were incredibly rare. Incredibly rare particularly when you're looking at the numbers that you're talking about. But when they occurred, there was actually a reasonable mortality rate as regards those clots. And it's very interesting that what you're saying is that mortality rate has almost gone down by a factor of 10. The simple fact being is that now that they know that there is this risk, the risk is then able to be better managed, and then therefore the risk is actually substantially less. And so, being able to reduce that by a factor of 10 simply by being aware of what it is, being able to monitor people and being able to treat it better, I think once again gives people, cuts through the noise that you hear about, firstly, what is the level of that risk, which, as you're saying, is almost infinitesimally small. And secondly, that even if that risk actually does happen to you, the likelihood of it being in any way, a fatal event is reduced now by a factor of 10. And as you say, comparing that to the ordinary course of life, these risks actually disappear, into the distance. That's not suggesting that there is absolutely no risk, but that the simple fact of living and breathing, it probably has more risk than what this does. And I think one of the areas that, hopefully in the fullness of time that we will get better at as a society is being able to actually communicate that risk and how it actually is a dynamic process about being able to identify and then manage that risk.
So I was reminded of this by looking at Brett Sutton's comment on the news last night, where he showed that one of the 30-year-old who was infected in Melbourne had moved into households containing 70-year-olds who had not been immunised. When you look at that and you know that if you get COVID, if you're a 70-year-old or more, you have a 5-fold increase in death rate, meaning 5%, that's 1 in 20. So if you look at deaths from AstraZeneca in this vaccine, that's 1 in 2 million. You're comparing it, but if you're standing next to or contract the illness, it's 1 in 20. And that's what the government's done, is in trying to work out how to manage the risk, the infinitesimal risk of the vaccine against the risk of COVID. It's what's, it's almost in accountancy terms, what's on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And that was the reason for the 50-year cutoff.
And so, Tony, we'll come back to kind of AstraZeneca versus Pfizer in a second and Moderna. But if we just actually jump onto effectiveness, if we think about the effectiveness of these vaccines, and actually it probably does make sense to compare them, I think it's the numbers that we're actually now getting as these vaccines go into the field, and as we're getting a sense of what they are as they're being deployed at great scale, appears to be extraordinarily high in the context of vaccines more broadly and the experience that we've had. Do you just want to talk about that, Tony and Sarah?
Yeah, we have, when we look at vaccine trials, we look at the efficacy probably within about 30,000 people. But then we monitor what happens afterwards, and that's called field effectiveness. And in the field effectiveness trials, we found that in Scotland and the UK, that AstraZeneca and Pfizer were very equivalent. They're around about 90% effective, 100% effective against preventing death and severe disease, and about 90% effective against preventing any disease at all. The other data that's come out of Israel, which is very encouraging, is at least in the early phases, we only know Pfizer vaccine in Israel because they got Pfizer. It seems to be also effective against all of the variants at this stage. So that is the one thing that we are worried about, is the aging, but they look quite good in field effectiveness trials. But our problem may well be the immune compromised, people who have transplants, hemodialysis, and they may need special strategies for immunisation. That's one of the things that Sarah and I are interested in.
And Tony and Sarah, as we're then moving into people having the opportunity, particularly those who might be aged over 50, if they have the opportunity to then be getting the AstraZeneca vaccine, should they be getting it or should they be waiting?
Get it now. Think about what happened with these households in Melbourne. If you're a 70-year-old in those households and you delayed to try and get Pfizer and you got COVID, you'd be kicking yourself. I think we can't guard against the possibility that these little outbreaks, I think our contact tracing is pretty good, but you can't guard against that happening again anyway. No, don't you agree?
I agree. So we do have a very good quarantine system, but there have been outbreaks from the quarantine system. And for example, on May 5th, there were 2 people who were infected in New South Wales, and we still have not identified how they were infected. So there'll continue to be small outbreaks, especially as there's an asymptomatic phase of this infection. People could be walking around not even knowing they're infected. So I think it'll be very difficult to totally eliminate this virus. So we definitely have to have people vaccinated. That's the only way you can really protect yourself. And look to the countries that have had, like the United States, 60% of people have had the one shot, and they've decreased their infection frequency by 35%. That's really quite incredible and wonderful for that country, to be honest.
And so when it is then that if we're thinking about, Sarah, in addition to that, one of the areas of discussion has been around women of younger women who are of either pregnant or looking or have suspicions they might be or looking to get pregnant. Any advice for them when they're thinking about this decision?
Absolutely. Please get vaccinated, because as this pandemic has continued, we have found that women who are pregnant have a more severe disease of COVID-19. And that's due to the fact that your immune system is a little bit challenged because you are carrying a person. So that it's really important for women who are thinking about getting pregnant or who are pregnant to please get vaccinated. Because when you do become pregnant, you could experience very severe disease from COVID-19 if you become infected.
Right. And we've had a few questions in the chat here about side effects. Have either of you or yours been vaccinated? And if so, have you heard of side effects? And what was it like?
I'm PF and this is ISA. So together we make Pfizer. So,
right.
So yes, I think all of my family have now been immunised. My son is delighted at the age of 37 to be immunised because he qualifies. And I've been immunised through the hospital connections. The whole institute's been immunised through the hospital connections as phase 1A. My son is delighted because he's always worried because he moves around more than we do. And this may apply to a lot of the audience. He's worried he'll bring the virus home to his aging parents. I'm older than I look, you know. I mean, so there we are.
And I would say that I have a lot of family who live in the United States, and all of them are vaccinated, including my 95-year-old mother. And the only side effects one family member had was fatigue. And I'm vaccinated as well. And the only thing I had was a bit of a sore arm.
Me too.
After the first vaccination, but the second vaccination was even less problematic. So I would say there's very mild side effects compared to what this disease can do to you.
But it is variable. You know, one of our young people today had to go home. The second vaccine for Pfizer is more what we call reactogenic. So there are the side effects you expect from vaccines, like the ones I've been working with in the past. Fatigue, chills, muscle aches, sore arm, nausea, and they can be quite marked with the second vaccine with Pfizer. They tend to tail off with AstraZeneca with the second vaccine.
So a PhD student wrote to me today, and she just received her second vaccine yesterday. And she said, Sarah, I had chills and fever last night, so I think I'll stay home. And I said, that's great, your immune system's working. Yeah. So, and I said, of course, stay home. Yeah. But
and one of the concerns we've just had from some of the people on the chat have been, if I get the vaccine, am I at any risk of actually, because I have, you know, in a sense, I have some element of COVID, am I at risk of actually passing this on to anyone in my household? Any comments?
So the vaccine is made of a very small fragment of the virus. So it just trains your immune system to recognize the virus, but it does not cause you to be infected by the virus. It's a very different way of really educating your immune system, saying, here's a fragment of the virus. When you see this fragment, you attack it and you remove the virus from your system. So no, there's no way after you're vaccinated can you pass on the virus unless you become infected.
Yes, you can get infected early after the first dose. You get full immunity 2 weeks after the second Pfizer dose, and full immunity again, about a week after the second AstraZeneca dose. You get good immunity about 2 to 3 weeks after the first dose. Yeah. So about 76% for AstraZeneca. So, you know, those side effects, as Sarah says, are an indication that the immune system is working. But be reassured, if you don't have those reactions, it doesn't mean the vaccine's not working. There's not actually a connection between the two.
No, I mean, I had very mild side effects at all. I mean, just a sore arm, and I know I have immunity. So.
Oh, you checked it. So I haven't checked mine. But the other thing to say is that if you have COVID and you get a vaccine, no problem. And in fact, one dose seems to be giving you a pretty good response after COVID. So that's actually being studied now.
Yeah, so if you were infected with COVID, go ahead and get vaccinated. Yeah. You'll have even a better response.
The vaccine only hangs around for about 2 days, and the little factory that produces all of the goodies is actually found in the lymph glands under the arm, goes into the muscle, and then the vaccine goes into the lymph gland and only hangs around for a couple of days, and then all traces of the vaccine are gone. They do not stick around in your cells.
They just educate your immune system to respond if you do get exposed to the virus.
And Sarah and Tony, we have a few people who've asked that they've recently had the flu vaccine, and as to whether this impedes their ability to be vaccinated with the COVID vaccine. Naturally enough, their GP is probably a very good source of information on this, but do you have any thoughts?
Sure, they need to wait 2 weeks after their flu vaccination to receive a COVID-19 vaccination. Right. So just wait 2 weeks, have your flu vaccination, that's great, but then wait 2 weeks.
But we don't really know, and trials are going to be run probably in Australia, probably here. We know that with the other vaccine, I've been working with Shingrix, for instance. At first, we gave the same advice, and then the trials were run and found that if you had a Shingrix in one arm, and that's a shingles vaccine, and a flu vaccine in the other arm, you've got two little factories working away, and they don't affect each other. You produce the right amount. So probably we may find the same thing with COVID in the future, but let's abide by the recommendations until we know 2 weeks separating either.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of how this works, at the moment, you get people going out and getting vaccinated. Do you anticipate that we're going to actually need a booster on a go-forward basis, both to deal with the efficacy of the vaccine over time, but also to deal with new strains as they emerge?
Yeah, so what we have to do is follow, and this is something that Tony and I are involved with actually, is we will be following people after they've been vaccinated to see how long their immune response lasts. We don't know. These are new vaccines and a new virus, and we're educating our immune system to a new virus. So we don't know how long these vaccinations will last. Most likely we will need a booster, and that could be a year or two later. A lot of vaccines are that way, though. If you look at hepatitis B, you require boosters. Other vaccines, you require boosters.
Well, they're longer. Yeah, they're longer. The shingles vaccine, for instance, we know from recent data, lasts even in aging people about 7 to 8 years. So, so not all, but certainly tetanus and pertussis.
So we have to really follow patients to really see how long their immune response lasts. There are some studies coming out of both the UK and the United States, and we're running one here together, Tony. But so we'll know more as we go forward, but I would guess we will most likely need a booster. And then in regards to the variants, what the biggest worry about the large numbers of infections happening in India and other countries is that new variants are arising. For example, the one that's just been identified in India. And these new variants could cause a problem for our vaccine efficacy. So really the reason to be vaccinated is to prevent variants from arising. But if these variants are a problem for the vaccines, the vaccine companies are watching these variants very closely, and they can develop boosters that would actually be effective against these variants. So these variants are being monitored worldwide.
The World Health Organization has set up a network for monitoring these vaccine strains, just as it does for influenza. And so with flu, we have boosters every year, which adjust to the changes in strains. So that system is being adapted by WHO for worldwide surveillance. So should something arise in one of the countries, another COVID strain, then it'll be quickly translated and recommendations adopted.
And the companies have said that they can very quickly make these boosters.
41 days,
yeah.
Moderna.
So, So I think that that's not a worry as we go forward.
Yeah. They're testing both, I think Moderna, Pfizer and AstraZeneca are all testing their new variant boosters at present. We're involved in a phase 1 trial here where the same could be done with what's called a DNA vaccine.
Yeah. And one other thing I would like to bring up, Ivan, is that these vaccines, both today Moderna and Pfizer, have been shown to be safe for 12 to 15-year-olds. So 2 weeks ago, Pfizer was approved by the FDA to be given to 12 to 15-year-olds, and Moderna has just released its data today, and it looks very promising. And so what they're doing in the States right now is they're actually offering vaccinations to people who are 12 to 17-year-olds at food trucks, at amusement parks. They're actually saying they may open up vaccination sites at pools during the summer now in the United States. So that's really good news that these vaccines are effective for 12 to 17-year-olds as well.
Because of the spread issue, more than disease.
Yeah.
But I think the Northern Territory are going to do the same. They're going to immunise a 16-year-old. So they are.
Now we have, there's loads of questions in the chat. Thank you. We unfortunately won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm trying to cover off those as best I can in terms of, some categories here. We have a question. Does the vaccine, quite quickly we could deal with, does the vaccine alter your DNA?
No. Can't get into your DNA. The RNA vaccines don't get into the nucleus, and neither do the DNA vaccines, even those, and there are none of those licensed yet. And certainly the AstraZeneca does.
So the RNA stays even outside of the nucleus of your cell. It doesn't even go anywhere near the nucleus of your cells. So these mRNA vaccines, that RNA is nowhere near your DNA, and neither would a DNA vaccine either.
No, that's what I said. Yeah.
Now, the next one is that there's apparently been blood clots from the mRNA vaccines that have not been reported as much. Now, you guys are across the medical research and things here more than probably anyone else in this country. Is there blood clots coming from the mRNA vaccines, which are Pfizer and Moderna, that people are not being told about?
No, I've gone into this with one of my hematologist colleagues, and it was looked at very carefully. There have been some cases of low clotting cells with Pfizer and Moderna, not life-threatening, but no cases of this syndrome reported with the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is even rarer. There are, blood clots are very common, and so you'll find blood clots in the placebo group in the trials, and in fact in the AstraZeneca trials, which only tested 60,000, so they probably didn't pick up this syndrome. There were more clots in the placebo group than the vaccine group.
There's some questions on here about people that are on either antidepressants or immunosuppressants. Any thoughts for them if we deal with them in order, Tony? If you're on antidepressants?
Antidepressants are not going to alter the situation at all.
So they should be vaccinated?
Yes, they should be immunised. Immunosuppressants, it depends on the degree of immunosuppression. We haven't tested out the vaccines in detail in people who are on transplants, but we do know some anecdotal studies that the responses are not as good in people who've had transplants and are severely immunocompromised. People who are mildly immunocompromised, say for rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, we're just writing a position paper on that at present in MS, We don't have data. We do have some expert advice, and that advice is really quite complex. And I would advise people who have MS or rheumatoid arthritis to talk to their specialists about this, because it depends on the agent you're on. It's quite different.
We also have some questions on here from people. Someone has anaphylactic reaction to dairy. Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know the age of that person, so it depends which vaccine they receive. But if they receive either the Pfizer vaccine, what happens is they will watch you for 30 minutes, and they have medical staff there, especially those who have experienced any sort of anaphylactic shock. They are watched for 30 minutes. Those of us who haven't were watched for 15 minutes. But if you've had anaphylactic shock, this happens very rapidly with these vaccines, if that's going to be an issue. And there is medical staff there watching right away, and they have an EpiPen right at the ready. So, Tony, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I think it's certainly true that people who've had an anaphylactic response to anything or severe allergy in the past need to report that at the time that they are being immunized. They are people more at risk. And so I reported that as a kid, I had quite a severe swelling of my arm to bee stings, but that was probably excessive. It's really the anaphylactic response.
Yeah. So just be very honest when you go in to get your vaccine. And
they'll keep you a bit longer.
They'll keep you a bit longer, but that's okay. It's very friendly there.
We have another question, which I thought was really interesting. Someone here is saying that they've seen frequently a myth around vaccine shedding, to the extent that some businesses in their local area, such as hairdressers and wellness centres, are actually denying service to those who've received an mRNA vaccine. Any views?
No, you're not shedding virus. You have a small fragment of the virus in those vaccines. There is no way a virus can be created from that small fragment. So you would not be shedding any virus at all.
It's a molecule that's actually stuck in your lymph node, which is the gland under here. It's a bit hard to see how it can get out to the hair, quite frankly.
No. And again, it's a very small fragment of the virus. You are not shedding the whole virus. You're not being even exposed to the whole virus.
Yeah. Now getting onto some stuff, which I think is really important. We have a question in here about how can we be confident that there will be no long-term side effects as a result of this, which I think is a question that many people quite rightly are asking. How do you answer those questions?
With every vaccine, we undergo post-marketing surveillance. That's what this group that's run by my colleagues next door called Vax Safety does. And you're right, every now and then you come up with things like the fever that that kids suffered after a bad batch of flu vaccine in Perth, and also people who got sleepy narcolepsy after a bad batch of flu vaccine in Europe. So it's very important that we do actually watch all our medications. Quite frankly, it's very important that we watch our road traffic too and make sure that we reduce risk and mortality there. But there is a very clear system for monitoring safety of these vaccines. If they're going to turn up, they're going to be very rare, and it'll be because of the fact that we're a very genetically diverse population, and some people get some things, some get others. The important thing is if these rare side effects turn up, as I said before, you need to understand them, research them and manage them, because you don't throw out such an exceptionally good vaccines as we've now got for this on the basis of, 1 in a million side effects. You learn how to manage them. That's what we've got to do.
And just continuing to work through some of the questions here.
Ivan, I wonder if I can just say one other thing.
Of course.
Polio vaccine. I don't know anybody who can, certainly you and me, well, I can at my age,
Tony, please, come on.
Polio. What polio was like. Polio was like this thing, you know, people were banning visits, yellow crosses on doors. I used to see people who had the residuum of polio. We have no polio in our community, and yet one of the vaccines turned up to have a 1 in 17 million side effect. So that's when you actually survey people, that may happen. But would you pull any of those vaccines for what we've now got? Our kids are safe, they don't have polio? I don't think so.
Some other questions here. Hormone replacement therapy. Any issues for ladies who may be on hormone replacement therapy?
No issues. The clots that you might get on hormone replacement therapy, which, you know, you've got to be a bit wary about HRT in terms of the side effects of clots. That's got to be carefully explained to you, risks and possibilities by your doctor. But there's no evidence that the conventional risk factors for clots have any effect on this very rare syndrome, which is due to odd antibodies that turn up in the circulation.
Right. And cutting to, which I think is a really important bit, there's some other detailed questions about specific medical conditions, which I'd encourage people who are listening to this, if they do have concerns about that, as always, your GP is the very best source of intelligence on that. So I'd really encourage you, if to be asking your GP any of these questions anyway. But let's just zoom out a little bit about the importance of even those with, who might be young and robust like me, dare I say, to then be thinking about, what is it for us in terms of then being vaccinated? What do we think is required in terms of then, if we really want to start living a normal life, we really want to start getting to the point where we can at least reopen state borders and not be concerned about outbreaks in certain cities, and with one eye on what appears to be the quite distant future, reopen our national borders. What is the importance of actually broad-based vaccination and the levels of population that we're going to need getting vaccinated in order to get back to those, therefore putting a responsibility on us to actually be vaccinated to allow life to then resume for Australia?
So I think what we need, Ivan, is at least 75% of people being vaccinated, at least 75%. Better to go to 85%, because for us to really develop herd immunity across Australia so that we can travel freely throughout the states of Australia and also to Tasmania, it's really, really key that at least 75% of people are vaccinated, although I would prefer to see 85%. And that will protect everyone. It's really a social obligation. It's not really for yourself that you're being vaccinated. It's so that you can protect others, so that you don't expose others, and that you can prevent others from being exposed.
So we need to remember, when these vaccines were developed, they're developed to try to protect the vulnerable in particular, to try and reduce death. That was our primary aim, and that's why phase 1A was aimed at the aging and immune compromised and our frontline health workers. That, I think, tells us something. It tells us that we want to protect the virus coming into those populations, and we also want to try and prevent the virus from getting out of quarantine, which is the reason for immunising our frontline workers, which is incredibly important. However, as time went on with the field effectiveness studies, we found to our delight, because it wasn't certain this would be the case, it's always harder to prevent against infection than disease, that the prevention, that the reduction in spread is about 85% with Pfizer in the UK, and family studies show also that there's a prevention, not a prevention, a reduction in spread in families with AstraZeneca. So that tells us that there is a way out of this, as you said, with the USA, and that is to immunise everyone we can. Now, we had problems with measles, and people get there was a very effective campaign when our immunisation rates dropped below 85% in this country. Measles is more infectious than COVID. In fact, it's about 5 times more infectious, would you believe? So we got up to well over 90%, around the 95% level in this country in terms of measles immunisation. So we can do this. We really can. It's a matter of really people understanding the benefits of immunisation. And of course, the key issue for us is to immunise the world, because that means fewer variants, fewer people coming in. I can go back to Indonesia and go scuba diving. That's just a selfish request, but it is incredibly important, because we could see further waves of this virus in Africa. We've seen it in South Africa, but there are places in the world. We thought India was immune. First wave, no problem, not too many deaths. The Prime Minister opened up, big crowds, and look what's happened. So
and those
very
crowds,
important.
yeah, and those crowds were super spreader events. So
Yes, yeah.
that's what happened in India. And I think India is also struggling with one other thing, which could happen in other countries as well. And that is, even though people have recovered from COVID-19, because their immune system has been slightly damaged by, by that recovery system, by recovering from infection, a fungus has actually infected these patients and is killing people as well. So I think really the best thing for all of us to do at this point is to be vaccinated.
Yeah, I do think that we do need to improve our quarantine a bit. And I do like the idea of the Victorian Mickleham approach. Hotels have done incredibly well. 99.99% is great, but it might even be better if it's 99.999%. So I think we might have to do something more about quarantine. So I'd be watching this space as the Commonwealth and states confer.
But in order for us to get to open and become internationally interacting with our international partners, we do need the rest of the world to be vaccinated. Currently, the majority of vaccines are going to 10 different countries. We really need the vaccinations to be made available globally in order to really be able to have a true international interaction with partners internationally.
China and Russia are doing better than we are in terms of distribution globally of vaccines, aren't they? That's not good.
Yeah. Now, as a last point to finish on, it's always kind of, as a wise person once told me, it's always darkest before the dawn. There's lots of kind of, there's lots of issues around the issues that the impact that COVID is having on our societies, and the challenges as we've discussed here about, vaccination and the impacts that has. But, I suppose my take on this is that we've made such unbelievable progress. Science was thrown a real curveball, and a challenge was actually thrown down to science 15 months ago. And science has stepped up and answered that challenge in an unmistakable way in terms of how it's actually answered that. And ultimately, what is science other than human ingenuity? And that we've really made arguably decades of progress in terms of what we might have been able to achieve in dealing with not only things like COVID, but in terms of then the side effects that we then get about how it is we think about vaccines, how it is we think about diseases like malaria, how it is that we deal with remote consultations for general practice, how it is that we deal with then, the use of technology in terms of keeping our societies and our health robust. What do you guys think of that perspective? Am I being Pollyanna-ish or overly optimistic, or do you feel that as well in terms of the way that you're looking at the opportunities for progress and medicine and health more broadly?
I believe that the technology that we used to develop the vaccines for COVID-19 will be used again. And it's really pushed our technologies to the forefront and allowed us to really realize that we can respond very quickly to a pandemic. And I believe that COVID-19 won't be our last pandemic. And so by having this technology and knowledge that we can very quickly develop vaccines that could essentially save the globe, that's really, really important. And that we can develop these technologies quickly and reapply them to other diseases is really important.
I totally agree. My interest has been in vaccines for the aging, and I've been delighted that the new shingles vaccine's 90% effective, but flu is only 50% and the pneumonia vaccine is only 50%. That's why we've been pleased to see about an 80% level for these vaccines. But I think we've got a way to go with immune compromised. So I think what this pandemic has shown is all the things the two of you have said, but it's also exposed a few gaps, and I think it's enabled a number of us to proselytise to state and Commonwealth governments, and we're being listened to by the politicians, and we need better networking of our research processes throughout Australia, better pipelines, better manufacturing, sovereign capacity to produce vaccines on our soil. Pfizer's gone to Singapore. We're now talking about RNA vaccines. We need research and development to take us in the next iteration of vaccines, not necessarily RNA vaccines, and we need to be able to do it onshore, I think is critical. And I think government is recognising that. So there's a silver lining. CSL was the legacy of the 1918-19 flu pandemic, which was worse than this. So we hope there'll be other legacies coming out of this as well.
Thank you.
And one other thing I would say, Ivan, quickly, is that this pandemic has really shown us how interconnected we are as a globe, and how we really have to work together.
Totally right, Sarah. I hope that people have found this beneficial. I'll throw back to Andrew in just a sec, but what I would say is that there is many more pieces of information like this that please connect with WIMR in all the various social channels. So the Westmead Institute for Medical Research on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. Please connect in with that if you'd like to keep up to date on this. We'd love you to keep up. Please, we'd love you to actually connect in to get on our mailing lists and find ways to support us in various ways, even if it's just spreading the word for what WIMR is doing and these messages. We will be putting snippets of this onto our socials. Encourage you to look at those and share those as best you can. We think that actually getting the word out there as best as we can is really an important step to fighting this virus and the side effects. Andrew, back to you, and thank you very much for your time and the opportunity to speak to your members.
Wow. On behalf of CBHS, thanks everyone for joining us today. And of course, a big thank you to our wonderful panel of contributors today, led by Ivan there in the facilitation, and Sarah and Tony, just a wealth of knowledge. So thank you very much. As we can all see and appreciate after listening to that, there's extensive work happening behind the scenes. So on behalf of all Australians, in particular Sarah and Tony, thank you for all the great work you're doing and leading this country to the safe place that we'd like it to be. Thank you also to those that submitted questions, both before the session and during the session. I think you got, during the session, 107 questions, Ivan, so you did really well to consolidate all those and bring some insights through some themes there. And it really made for some lively, insightful, and what I thought was compelling and relevant discussion. To those that are listening, we'd love to get your feedback on this particular session. There will be a short survey popping up, which shouldn't take more than a few moments for you to complete, which we would greatly appreciate you doing. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope you feel more empowered to make the right decisions for yourselves, your family, and as Sarah eloquently put it, our social obligation to the rest of Australia and the world. Have a great afternoon. Stay safe and stay healthy and happy. Thank you very much.